In today's video, we're going to be going over why cheap Section 8 doors aren't always as cheap as you think they are. Let's dive right into the video today. All right, you guys, so like I was saying, cheap doors aren't always good deals, and there are so many gurus right now in the market that are advertising buy properties that are $60,000, buy properties that are $50,000. They're cash flowing so much. So in today's video, we're going to be breaking down what you need to be on the lookout for and the psychology that you need to step into that space with before you actually make any purchases, especially for super cheap doors. By the end of this video, you're going to be able to answer four extremely important questions. The first one is, why is a cheap property actually priced as low as it is, right? There's a reason behind it. The second question you're going to be able to answer is, what does a cheap door really cost over 5 years? We're going to be looking at two different properties side by side so you can really see what the numbers look like. The third thing that you're going to be able to answer by the end of this video is, when is a cheap door still a smart purchase or investment to buy for myself? And lastly, how do I check if a low price is actually a good deal? All right. So again, guys, a cheap door is always going to look like a steal, right? Especially if we're looking at just the purchase price. There's not a lot of markets that are growing and expanding where you can buy property sub $100,000. Okay, a lot of people just see one number. It's loud, simple, and it's easy to fall in love with how cheap that property is. Okay, but what you guys are not taking into account is the total cost of ownership. What does it actually look like to own that property that you're getting in so cheap for over the course of a time period, right? And a lot of people don't talk about this. A lot of people want to talk about the instant gratification, year one results, right? But what do year 5 and year 10 results actually look like, all right? People are not taking into account the rehab, the repairs, the vacancy, the turnover, and what the exit pool actually looks like long term, okay? So again, why is the property so cheap? Guys, I promise you, I've been in this space now for at least 5.5 years, or going on 5.5 years. And I'm telling you guys, the market is not stupid, okay? There is always a give and a take relationship when it comes to this, regardless if it's a creative financing thing, regardless if it's price, area, whatever the case may be. A low price is always compensation for something, okay? These are four of the most main and typical things that price is a compensation for. First off, it could be condition, right? There could be older roofs, right? HVAC, plumbing, something waiting to fail. And when I say waiting to fail, I don't mean the seller is intentionally saying, hey, these items are going to fail on you. But a lot of times when you're buying cheaper properties, the landlord that you're buying it from probably hasn't done anything to the property. No new roof, no new HVAC, no new plumbing, no new electrical, right? Which means eventually whatever landlord is going to own it is going to be the one responsible for it. And that's typically us, right? When it comes to buying those cheap properties. The next thing it's going to account for is location, right? Right? Cheap properties account for worse school districts, higher crime, weaker areas in general, less appreciation, all right? The third thing that it's going to account for is tenant quality, right? When you're dealing in super low income areas, you're typically going to have more opportunities to be burned by tenants that are not respectful of your property, right? Again, crime in that given area, damage to your property, things along those lines. So again, price is always compensating for something, okay? And then there's also the difficulty of exiting, okay? If you're in a market that's flatlining, or if you're in an area within a market that's flatlining, that's slowly going down, that's not appreciating, it's not where the development is happening, right? The only thing that you're looking for is cash flow. There's going to be difficulty exiting, right? Because as that market or that area progresses, it can progress and get even worse, which means when you're ready to liquidate and exit that property, there might not be a pool of investors that is interested in buying, in a slum-like area, okay? So again, all things to be very cognizant of when you're looking at a super cheap property, okay? Again, this is what it looks like to really buy a cheap door. So again, the things that people like to advertise to you guys is how low the price is, right? The smallest check to get into the door. Look how high this cash flow is on paper. It looks amazing. Look at how much instant equity that you can get day one by closing on this property, right? So it's an easy yes when it's easy to get into, when the numbers look too good to be true, all of these things. But again, in reality, the things that should be going on in the back of your mind as a high alert type of situation is what it actually costs, right? So again, frequent CapEx hits, right? You're going to be responsible for some level of CapEx. Okay, and again, we're going to look at the numbers here shortly, but you need to be prepared to replace a roof, to replace some HVAC or plumbing. And I'm not saying all these things happen the same day, but you need to mentally prepare and financially prepare yourself so that when this does happen, because this will happen, right? Unless you're selling it within a year, selling it within 2 years, you need to be prepared for something like this. Okay, you need to be prepared for longer vacancy in bad areas. Okay, you need to be prepared for lower quality tenants. Okay, and again, harder to manage certain exits. If you're not going in, if you think it's rainbows and butterflies in super low income areas, okay, there's a give and a take. If there's an easy entry, it's because it's difficult somewhere else. All right. Okay, this is the two deals that we're going to look at side by side, right? There's a cheaper property right here, which is at $75K in Cleveland, Ohio. And then we have our more quality property at $130,000. Okay, I just want to articulate the fact that when I talk about cheap and quality, I'm not talking about $500,000 homes. I'm just saying there's a lot of people on the internet right now that are talking about buying properties sub $75,000, sub $80,000, and the market no longer is built for that anymore, right? The same properties that you could buy in a place like Cleveland, in a place like Detroit, back in 2021, back in 2022 for $80,000, for $75,000, and they're in decent areas. Those same properties that I was purchasing are now worth $130,000, $140,000, $150,000, which means if I'm buying the new $80,000 to $75,000 property, I'm buying in a worse area, right? So again, things to be mindful of. So we're going to be comparing today a property selling for $130,000 and a property selling for $75,000, just so you can kind of get an idea. If you add up all these figures here for both, on day one, year one, the person that's moving forward buying a $130,000 property is looking at about $31,000, let's call it $32,000 out of pocket, compared to the person who's buying the cheap door at $18,000 out of pocket. Again, this is where a lot of people's analysis stops. They're like, oh my gosh, I can get into a property in the same market, but maybe a different area for $12,000 less. Great, sign me up, okay? But this is where they stop looking, okay? When we're looking at it from a 5-year standpoint, okay, we have to think of a few things, right? First and foremost, the quality property is going to get a higher rent, okay? Much higher than the cheaper property, okay? Again, upfront cash, like I said, the cheap property is winning all day, every day, okay? But when we start looking at rent growth, right, the cheaper properties in worse areas, your rent is not going to go up the same amount every single year. Not the same amount, it's not going to go up near as high. Right now, we're looking at about a 1% rental increase on super cheap properties in bad areas or neighborhoods compared to a quality property, which can go up by 3%. So if we're looking at gross rent compounded by their annual rate of growth, you've collected within 5 years about $67,333 with the cheap property and about $95,000, let's call it $95,500 on the more expensive property. Okay, we have to account for vacancy. So you notice that vacancy is much less with a quality property. You have 2x more vacancy to account for when you're dealing with vacant properties. A lot of people think are only accounting for, hey, my property is going to be rented 12 months out of the year. That is not a realistic expectation to set for yourself, all right? So when we subtract vacancy from both of these properties, naturally you're going to have more vacancy in the cheaper property, so that's why that number is going to be bigger, all right? The effective rent that you're collecting after these items are accounted for are the following, okay? Then you got to think about it, right? A more quality property, these properties typically have newer major CapEx items. HVACs, plumbing, electrical, roof, foundation adjustments, and things of that nature compared to the cheap properties that we're buying day one. So when you actually account for that over a 5-year span, and again, this is not me just giving you a bias, like the numbers will speak for itself. Over a 5-year term, the cheap property actually loses the investor north of $15,000 compared to a $7,000 gain with a more quality property, okay? And again, a lot of people aren't taking the time to do this math for themselves, that a more quality product in a better area, in a better market, makes more sense long-term than buying a cheap property that you can cash out with just year one, and then you're setting yourself up for a lot of risk. Okay, so like I said, it's 13K cheaper up front to get into that cheaper property. But see, what a lot of people don't understand is you're actually getting a better deal with the quality product or with the quality property, because the lender is actually financing some of these more quality pieces, right? So if I'm choosing to buy a $130,000 home, that newer roof that's already on that home, that newer HVAC, that newer plumbing that's already been installed, technically the lender's loan is helping me finance it. If I'm buying a cheap door and my roof goes out or my HVAC goes out, guess what? I'm now incurring the entire burden of that cost associated with the replacement, compared to allowing the lender to assist me with that by just choosing to buy a better product. All right. So next, when does a cheap door actually make sense? Again, everybody's different. You have to understand your own investment profile and criteria. So there are times where cheap doors make sense, and it's not about when the door makes sense. It's about, does the door make sense for who you are as an operator, okay? So like I said, a cheap door makes sense when you are expecting frequent spend. If you're prepared for it, if you know the game, right, then again, that's when a cheap door can make sense to you, because you're not going to be surprised. I see so many new investors get into these markets and everybody tells them it's sunshines and rainbows, right? And they're not preparing them for additional money outside of closing that's going to have to be spent on that property to get it rented, to get it ready, all these types of things. Okay, solid bones is super crucial. I've said these things so many times, right? I call them my big five. You have your HVAC and your water, your mechanicals. You have your plumbing, you have your electrical, you have your roof, and you have your foundation. These are going to be the top 5 most expensive things that you're dealing with in any property that you buy. You need to make sure these bones are good, especially on a cheap property, because those things are going to cost you the most. Okay. You also want to understand what the rent to price ratio is. Is the amount of rent that you're collecting from this cheap property going to cover the frequency of different things that you have to maintain and invest into the property? Okay. And lastly, you want to actually control the rehab, right? So you can either manage the cost ahead of time and account for something like this, or you can allow the property to have its way with you and just be surprised and not prepared and not setting aside funds to address some of these more major items. Okay. So there's a list of 5 different questions that I like to ask myself when I'm buying a cheap property, and I highly encourage all my clients to do so as well. The 5 things that I want you guys to start asking yourself when you're buying a cheap property is, what is it really going to cost me? Guys, stop looking at the sticker price. The sticker price is not your real cost. Analyze things over a long period of time, right? Real estate is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's not something that people just make a ton of money on year 1, year 2, especially if it's a buy and hold model. Okay, so you need to ask yourself, what does this really cost me over the length of a larger period of time? Okay, what is about to break, right? When we're looking at inspection reports, when we're just observing a property in general, okay, we have to assume something is about to break. Even if everything is functioning properly right now, all it takes is one day, one furnace to overheat, one winter storm, right? It just takes one of these things to make something go, right? So ask yourself, what's about to break? Okay. Again, will rent cover your maintenance headaches, right? And not will rent just cover it. Will the property even be occupied, which is question 2, for rent to be collected, right? Because again, if there's nobody in the property, now I'm incurring that full burden of replacing and fixing whatever I need to, okay? And do you have the option to sell this property later? Is the neighborhood in an inclining situation to where there's going to be people interested in investing in that area that you're dealing with, okay? So like I said, you guys, cheap doors are not always cheaper, and 9 times out of 10, they're not cheaper. All you're doing is deferring when you're paying the bill for something like this. I hope this video was extremely valuable. I hope you guys are learning a lot in these videos. Like I said, I'm trying to drop a new video every single week, so make sure you like, comment, and hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Peace.